The Contracts-Remedies question from July of 2007 is about as straightforward a contracts question as you could hope for. Have a look at the call of the question. It reads, can Paula obtain specific performance of Sally's agreement to sell Paula the painting? Discuss. This is a call of the question that you can outline a complete answer to without any reference to the fact pattern. In order for us to be able to answer the question, can Paula obtain specific performance, we've got to do two things. First, we have to establish Paula's contract theory of liability against seller, and then we've got to go through the elements of specific performance. So without even reading the fact pattern, you're able to outline exactly the outline that I present in the outline of issues. Our first section is about the theory of liability. We talk about formation, defenses to formation, breach, defenses to breach, and then we reach a conclusion, because part two is all about specific performance. And in that section, all we do is go through the elements of specific performance and reach a conclusion. So we sketch that tentative outline just after reading the call of the question. You don't need to do anything more in order to come up with that basic skeleton. And as it turns out, that's all you need. Now go to the top of the pattern, and what you're going to see is a very complicated contract scenario. This is a tricky question, not because the law is complicated, it isn't. Not because the organization is complicated, it isn't. But because the facts are complicated. So have a look. In the first couple of paragraphs, we get to know Paula. She is a recent art school graduate who wants to become an art acquisition agent, somebody who goes out and finds paintings for collectors that want to buy specific works. And we learn about her first commission to find for museum any of a series of Monet paintings. And so she goes out looking for them. And in paragraph 3, she tracks down Sally, the defendant seller from the call of the question. She's a private collector, and she's got what Paula's client is looking for. And now, within paragraph 3, we get a lot of factual material that's going to be relevant to establishing Paula's theory of liability. Notice within the negotiations, Sally, the seller, expresses offhandedly how proud she was that she sold only to private collectors. And Paula doesn't comment on that observation. And right after the transaction is complete orally, Paula calls the curator at museum and causes a $200,000 wire transfer to go into Sally's account. Then in paragraph 4, we find Sally's breach. Paula goes to tell Sally which painting she has decided to pick up. Sally won't go through with the sale, and Sally accuses Paula of deceit. So we know what Sally's defense to breach is going to be. And you know what? We also know that this is not a very strong defense unless something else happens later on. And Sally indicates that when she got the money from museum and she realized the painting wouldn't be held privately anymore, she decided to back out. And Sally gives Paula a certified check which had been signed and drawn from her bank account, refunding the $200,000. And in the last paragraph, Paula won't take this check and instead wants the painting. And she explains why she hadn't disclosed her principal's identity. And you know what? It seems like a reasonable rationale to me. Certainly a legal rationale. And then Sally further explains another of her defenses by saying that the contract wasn't in writing. And then she repeats the allegation of deception. And then we get this question about specific performance. And I can tell you a couple of things up front. Number 1, you could outline this question before you even read the fact pattern and come up with something that's entirely serviceable. And number 2, it's okay for you to conclude either way on this question. There's plenty of gray areas being tested here, and so we're not that worried about what the quote-unquote correct answer is. Now, as it turns out, I go against the grain of my usual defense bias, and I come through for the plaintiff. I think she can get specific performance, and that's the conclusion that I reach. So turn the page and have a look at the outline of issues. And as you'll see, other than going into greater depth about the defenses to formation, there's nothing more in this outline than there was when I first looked at the call of the question. we know that Paula's theory is based on contract. So the basic structure is formation, defenses to formation, breach, and defenses to breach. But we have specific facts in the pattern that require us to go into a little greater depth, and they are not hard to spot. Sally indicates in 2 different places that she thinks Paula committed some kind of fraud, and we also know that Sally alleges that the fact the contract wasn't in writing is enough for her to escape liability. And it turns out both of those defenses are lousy, but we still have to go into them in a fair amount of depth. But otherwise, the structure of our analysis is established really before we read the fact pattern. And similarly, with regard to specific performance, all I'm doing is breaking it down into the elements that most of us learned years ago. Now, sometimes in remedies problems, I will squish specific performance down into 1 or maybe a couple of very compact paragraphs. Usually the reason for doing that is time management, and to present the most effective and complete answer possible when there are many issues being tested. But this question really is only asking us about specific performance. There really aren't any big damages or restitution issues present here. And so it's appropriate to split it up into elements and then deeply go into each element. So now let's have a look at the model answer that I've offered for this question. And right away you'll see that this is an answer that goes into a great deal of depth with regard to the facts. This is not a terribly difficult question because it's so easy to organize well. But as I indicated up front, this question is complicated factually. And so we have to split it up into its pieces and then go into the pieces. Notice up front, I lead with the facts. I indicate what Paula is seeking, specific performance of a contract to purchase a painting. And I indicate that the common law is going to govern this dispute because a painting is not a manufactured good. I go into formation, and you'll notice that the actual discussion of formation is pretty simple because there isn't anything complicated about it. But the defenses to formation are more complicated. And have a look at the analysis of the statute of frauds. Notice, up front, I state a very concise rule of what the statute of frauds is. And then I'm very specific about applying the law to the specific facts of the question. And it seems to me that the statute of frauds is not going to be very good for a couple of reasons. First, the wire transfer is full performance by Paula, which almost certainly by itself would be enough to satisfy the statute of frauds. But take a look and go a step deeper into the analysis. The refund check almost certainly would be deemed a writing, which itself would be good enough to satisfy the statute of frauds. Because notice, Sally, the party to be charged, signed the check. And although it isn't on its face a written contract, it is a writing that proves up the existence of the agreement. Now, this is one specific point where you are welcome to disagree with me. But I think as you look at this, you will have to agree that an analysis of the check within the context of the statute of frauds is a fairly high level of analysis. I encourage you to achieve that level of depth in your own thinking. You don't have to agree with the outcome of the analysis. Now go into the fraud and the inducement section. And here again, there is room for reasonable people to differ about how to interpret these facts. But given that the reliability and confidentiality are qualities that are central to the art collection business, and given that Sally's almost certainly aware of those facts, it's probably not good enough to defeat the existence of the formation of this contract. Fraud and the inducement won't do a good enough job to invalidate the contract. Reasonable people can differ, but the defenses to formation offered by Sally really aren't good enough, to me, to defeat the existence of this contract. Now we have to consider breach and Sally's defenses to breach. And here the analysis is a lot more simple. You'll see that the breach section in my answer is really only 2 sentences long. Now, it would have been possible to go into greater depth with regard to the law of anticipatory repudiation, but I chose not to do so. Instead, I go to defenses to breach, and here again, the analysis doesn't have to go very deep, because the only defense that Sally possibly could offer would be to deny the existence of the contract, and we just got done concluding that, in fact, there is a contract. So I conclude at the end of part 1 that Paula does have a valid claim for breach of contract. And then we go on to consider her preferred remedy, specific performance, in Part 2. And so, let's have a look at that. Here again, I'm not doing anything especially innovative. All I'm doing is breaking the theory of relief into elements and then going into it. So we begin by discussing whether or not there's a definite and certain contract. Well, we just went into all of those issues earlier, and obviously I conclude that there is a real contract. Now, going into the inadequacy of legal remedy section, this is the area of specific performance that, it seems to me, requires the most careful consideration. Notice that it is possible for the defense to argue that what the plaintiff really expected out of this deal was a $15,000 commission. So let's just give her the $15,000 and be done with it. But the fact that this business and that these pieces of art are so specialized and unique almost certainly is going to be enough for the plaintiff to establish that her legal remedy really isn't adequate under these circumstances. Moving on to feasibility, this is an easy element for the plaintiff to satisfy, as is mutuality. Now, moving on to defenses, here again, Sally does have something to say, and here again, these defenses aren't going to be good enough, in my judgment, to defeat specific performance. And again, I counsel you to remember that if you look at these facts and reach an opposite conclusion based on your own sense of what would be fair under the circumstances, please remember that I'm not accusing you of being wrong. But I am the guy that often has a defense bias, even in my answers, and here I think the plaintiff wins. I think the plaintiff has the better case, and I would award specific performance.